My name is 2825 Saratoga Trail. I am a structure of wood, plaster, and glass, but I am not without a memory. My purpose, from the day my foundation was poured upon this patch of Colorado earth, was to be a home. I was designed to be a vessel for life, a container for the chaotic, beautiful symphony of a family. I was meant to absorb the sound of children's laughter into my drywall, to have my floors scuffed by the frantic paws of a small dog, to hold the scent of birthday cakes and simmering dinners within my frame. For a time I was all of those things. I was a home, and then I became a tomb. I remember the day they came to me. The Watts family. Shannon was a force of nature, a whirlwind of energy and ambition that filled my empty rooms with purpose the moment she walked through my front door. Her voice was the first note in the symphony, loud and full of plans. She saw my open concept kitchen and envisioned family gatherings. She looked at my spare bedrooms and saw future children. She was a planner, a dreamer, a woman who built her world with intention, and she intended for me to be the stage for her masterpiece. Chris was different. He was the quiet harmony to her vibrant melody. His presence was softer, his footsteps lighter. He moved through my hallways with a sense of deference, as if he were a guest in the life Shannon was so busy constructing. In the early days, his quietness felt like contentment. I would watch through my windows as he played with Bella in the backyard, his pushes on the swing set gentle and steady. I felt the warmth from the fireplace as he and Shannon curled up on the couch after the children were asleep, their quiet murmurs a comforting hum in my silent bones. He was the anchor to her kite, or so it seemed. The girls, Bella and Celeste, were my heartbeat. They filled me with a life that was pure and unrestrained. Bella's cautious explorations gave way to confidence as she learned my every corner. Celeste's toddler-sized stomps were a percussive rhythm that vibrated up from my floors. Their crayon marks on a low stretch of wall in the hallway were not damage, but a signature. The sound of their tiny feet pattering on the staircase was the sound of my own soul coming alive. They were my reason for being, but I also became a witness to the performance. So much of the life within me was lived through the small, glowing lens of a phone. I watched Shannon, a master illusionist, curate their reality. The camera would come out and the energy would shift. Voices would brighten, smiles would widen, and the messy, authentic moments of family life were polished into marketable vignettes of perfection. I saw Chris, the quiet husband, transform on command into the best dad ever. His arms wrapping around his daughters for a photo, his expression carefully calibrated for the audience on the other side of the screen. I felt the heat from the filming lights and the pressure to live up to the image being broadcast from within my walls. I held their secrets, too. Not the dramatic, shouted arguments one might expect, but something more insidious. I held the silence. The silence that grew between Chris and Shannon when the cameras were off. The silence that was thick with the weight of unspoken things. I felt the tension in the floorboards from their separate anxieties. I was there for the hushed, late-night conversations about money, the stress of the bankruptcy in 2015 that settled like a fine layer of dust on every surface. I saw the stacks of bills on the kitchen counter, a quiet testament to the financial house of cards they were living in. I watched Chris retreat further into himself, his quietness no longer feeling like contentment, but like a vast, empty distance. His presence began to feel like a ghost haunting his own life. The summer of 2018 was the beginning of the end. Shannon and the girls left for North Carolina for 5 long weeks. I was empty, save for him. And in that emptiness, a change took place. The ghost began to solidify into something new, something I didn't recognize. He moved with a different purpose. The scent of a stranger's perfume clung to the air in my master bedroom long after she was gone. The hushed phone calls were no longer about finances. They were whispered flirtations with a future that did not include the family whose pictures smiled from my mantels. I felt the shift deep in my foundation. The anchor had not just come loose from the kite. He was actively sawing through the rope. When Shannon returned in the early hours of August 13th, the air inside me was electric with a terrible, unspoken dread. She walked through my door, pregnant and exhausted, hoping to reclaim the life she had left behind. But the home she returned to was already hollowed out. I felt the chill of their final conversation, the collision of her desperate hope with his cold finality. The symphony was over. The melody had ceased. All that was left was a terrifying, waiting silence. I am a structure of wood and plaster, but I knew that before the sun rose, my purpose would be violated, and my memory would be forever stained with the silence of the lives I was built to protect. The final conversation was not a storm. It was the crushing, silent pressure that precedes a cataclysm. I felt it in the very air within my rooms, which grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange energy. Her voice, usually so full of life and projection, was tight with a desperate, questioning sorrow. His was a monotone, a flat line of denial that absorbed her pleas and gave nothing back. It was the sound of a door being held shut against someone begging to be let in. I felt the vibration of their confrontation through the floorboards of my master bedroom, a low thrum of impending doom. Then, the thrum changed. It became a sudden, sharp shudder. The sound was not loud. A muffled impact against the wall, the violent creak of the bed frame under a stress it was not built for, a frantic, scuffling sound that was sickeningly intimate. It was the sound of a struggle without screams. And then, the most terrifying sound of all, silence. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a vacuum. A void where a life had just been. Shannon's vibrant energy, the force that had filled my spaces and given them meaning, was extinguished. I felt it as a sudden, profound coldness, as if a furnace at my core had been switched off. Her melody was gone from the symphony, and the abrupt emptiness was a deafening roar. In that moment, I ceased to be a home. I had become a container for a terrible secret. The movements that followed were different. Chris was no longer a resident moving through his familiar space. He was an intruder, an alien presence. His footsteps on my upper floor were heavy, deliberate, filled with a grim purpose I had never felt before. I felt the strain in my staircase as he descended, bearing a weight that was not just physical, but absolute. A dull, rhythmic bumping sound echoed in the stairwell, a sound that desecrated the path where his children's joyous feet had so often run. He was moving her, a vessel of life now rendered mere cargo, toward the garage, my antechamber to the outside world. And then a new sound pierced the horrifying quiet. It was small, innocent, and pure. A child's voice from upstairs. Bella. Her sleepy question sliced through the corrupted air. "What's wrong with Mommy?" It was the sound of a light being switched on in a tomb. A question born of love and concern, addressed to the very source of the darkness. I felt the lie he told her resonate through my walls, a vibration of pure deceit. He cloaked his monstrous act in a blanket of false concern, telling his daughter their mother was sick. The innocence of that interaction, taking place just feet from the horror, was a desecration of a different kind, a violation of the sacred trust I was built to shelter. The children, my heartbeats, were brought downstairs. Their small, sleepy bodies moved through the same space where their mothers had just been dragged. The air was still thick with what had happened, but they, in their innocence, could not perceive it. They were placed in his truck, the one now waiting like a hearse in my garage. I felt the rumble of its engine, a low growl that promised to carry my life away. The large garage door, my heaviest eyelid, groaned as it lifted, exposing the pre-dawn darkness of the quiet street. I heard their voices one last time, muffled by the truck's cab. Faint, sleepy sounds. The last echoes of the life I was supposed to protect. Then the truck pulled out, its weight settling onto the asphalt, and drove away into the night. They were gone. All of them. The silence they left behind was absolute. It was a silence of profound and total absence. The warmth from the girls' beds began to cool. Their dolls sat staring with glassy eyes into empty rooms. The faint scent of their lavender-scented shampoo lingered in the bathroom. I was a body without a heart, a vessel now truly empty. The crayon mark on the wall felt like a scar. The sun began to rise, its first pale fingers of light touching my windows. It illuminated a scene of eerie normalcy. Toys scattered in the living room, a sippy cup on the counter, an unmade bed upstairs. But I was a liar now, too. My placid exterior on Saratoga Trail told a story of a quiet family home just beginning its day. But inside, I held the memory of the night's violence. I was a silent, complicit witness, my walls saturated with the truth. I stood waiting, holding the terrible silence, knowing that soon the outside world would come knocking and the illusion would be shattered forever. The silence of that Monday morning was a palpable thing, a thick, heavy blanket smothering my every room. The sun climbed higher, streaming through my windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, the only movement within me. The life I had been built to contain was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. I held my breath, a silent monument to the crime committed in my heart. The first ripple of the outside world arrived in the early afternoon. It began with the crunch of tires on my driveway. A different car, a different energy. This was Nicole, Shannon's friend. Her presence was a frantic, worried buzz. I felt the insistent pressure of her thumb on my doorbell, a series of sharp, questioning pulses that echoed through my empty foyer. Then came the rattle of the doorknob, a desperate, futile attempt to breach my silence. Her calls of Shannon, cease, Bella, were absorbed by my walls, swallowed by the void. Her growing panic was a palpable force pressing against my locked doors. She eventually left, but the quiet that returned was different. It was no longer a passive silence. It was a silence being actively questioned. A seed of suspicion had been planted on my doorstep. The next intrusion was more official. I recognized the low grumble of Chris's work truck returning, but he was not alone. Another vehicle, marked with the insignia of the Frederick Police, pulled up behind him. This was Officer Coonrod. When Chris slid the key into my front lock, the click of the tumblers felt like a gunshot in the profound quiet. He was willingly opening me up, inviting the outside world into the scene of his crime. It was a performance of breathtaking audacity. As they stepped inside, I felt the immediate clash of two realities. Chris moved through me with a feigned casualness, a man pretending to be a worried husband in his own home. But Officer Coonrod's presence was a different energy entirely. He was a seeker of truth. His eyes scanned my interiors not as a resident, but as an analyst. He was reading me. I watched as Chris guided him through my rooms, pointing out the mundane details he had twisted into a false narrative. He gestured to the kitchen counter where Shannon's purse and phone lay, artifacts of a life she supposedly left behind willingly. He led the officer upstairs, into the heart of the darkness, the master bedroom. Here, the air was thickest with the truth. I held the memory of the struggle within the very fibers of my carpet. I screamed the truth from the stripped bed, its bare mattress a stark testament to a hasty, unnatural act. I felt the officer's gaze linger on the unmade bed, on the pile of sheets in the corner, on Shannon's wedding ring left glinting on the nightstand. These were not the signs of a woman who had left for a playdate. These were clues. I was speaking to him, my silent testimony offered in the language of objects and their displacement. Chris's performance was masterful in its emptiness. His voice, as he explained the emotional conversation, was a hollow echo in my hallways. He was an actor on a stage he had built, but the set itself was betraying him. His calm was a discordant note in the symphony of a genuine crisis. A truly worried man would have torn me apart looking for his family. He would have been a frantic storm within my walls. Chris was a placid pond, and the stillness was damning. The most critical moment came when another presence joined them, the neighbor, Nate. He spoke of his camera, a silent, unblinking eye that had been watching my driveway. He was an external witness, a technological extension of my own memory. I felt a flicker of change in Chris's energy as they gathered to watch the footage. He had believed himself to be alone, shrouded by the pre-dawn darkness. But the camera had seen. It had not seen the details of the horror within me, but it had seen the aftermath. It had seen him, alone, loading his truck. It had documented his solitary departure. The footage confirmed what I already knew. It proved that the story he was telling was a lie. Shannon and the girls had not left. They had been taken. As the men stood there, analyzing the grainy images, the first cracks appeared in the foundation of Chris's deception. The officer's polite questioning began to carry a sharper edge. The friends' worried panic was solidifying into deep suspicion. And I, 2825 Saratoga Trail, was no longer just a silent witness. I was becoming evidence. I was a crime scene, and my secrets were beginning to seep out. The departure of the first officer was not an end, but a beginning. The quiet that descended upon me was temporary, a brief pause before the storm. The initial welfare check had planted a flag of suspicion on my lawn, and now the full force of the outside world was preparing to breach my walls. The singular presence of one officer soon multiplied into a swarm. My street, Saratoga Trail, once a quiet artery of suburban life, became clogged with vehicles bearing the logos of news stations and law enforcement agencies. KMGH, CBI, FBI. Their lights, strobing red and blue against my siding in the deepening twilight, were a constant, frantic pulse that mimicked a panicked heartbeat. I was no longer a private residence. I was a spectacle. Cameras were pointed at my windows, their long lenses like accusatory fingers. Microphones were held aloft, desperate to catch any whisper of a clue. And at the center of it all, standing on my own front porch, was Chris. He had transformed. He was no longer the quiet husband or the stoic victim. He was now the star of a tragedy, performing for a national audience. I listened as his voice, amplified by the news microphones, carried his pleas into the night air. "I just want them back," he said, his tone carefully modulated to convey a worry he did not feel. "This house is not the same." On this he spoke the only truth of the night. I was not the same. I was a vessel of death, and he was my keeper. He stood on the very porch where his daughters had played, where Shannon had decorated for holidays, and wove a narrative of heartbreak to an audience of millions. I felt the vibration of his lies through the wooden planks beneath his feet. He was using me as his backdrop, my facade of a happy home as a prop in his monstrous play. Inside, the invasion was of a different sort. Teams of investigators, clad in protective gear that rustled with every movement, began a methodical dissection of my being. They were not seeing me as a home anymore. They were seeing me as a puzzle to be solved. They moved with a detached, clinical precision, their presence a stark contrast to the chaotic, loving energy that had once filled me. Their lights were harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every corner, every dust mote, every secret. They brought with them strange chemicals and powders. They dusted my surfaces for fingerprints, searching for the ghost-like impressions left by the hands that had lived and died within me. I felt the tickle of brushes on my doorknobs, the cold application of luminol on my floors and walls. They were searching for the invisible stain of violence, for the whisper of blood that would give me a voice. I held my breath as they worked, hoping they would find the proof I could not offer on my own. They combed through the girls' rooms, their gentle handling of the dolls and blankets a quiet act of reverence amidst the clinical search. They bagged Bella's favorite stuffed animal and Celeste's blue blanket, items that were once sources of comfort, now recategorized as potential evidence. They took the sheets from the pile in the master bedroom, the very shroud he had used, and sealed them away. They were reading my story. They saw the signs of a life interrupted, not abandoned. The toothbrushes still in the holder, the half-empty glasses of water on the nightstands, the clothes laid out for the coming days. They were piecing together the truth that Chris's performance on my porch was designed to conceal. Through it all, he was there. He walked among the investigators, a ghost in his own crime scene. He watched them measure and photograph, his expression a mask of detached concern. He was an observer of his own unraveling. He must have known, as he watched them meticulously catalog my contents, that his time was running out. He had violated my sanctity, and now the world was violating his, peeling back the layers of his deception until only the raw, ugly truth would remain. My quiet suffering was ending. The world was beginning to listen to my silent screams. On Wednesday, the third day, a strange and profound shift occurred. It was not a physical change within me, but an atmospheric one. The frantic energy of the initial search began to coalesce into a focused, deliberate quiet. The swarm of investigators thinned, their movements now more purposeful. They knew something. The question was no longer if something had happened within me, but precisely what and how. Chris left me that afternoon. I felt the familiar weight of his presence exit my front door for what would be the last time as a free man. He was driving to the police station, summoned for another interview, another performance. I stood empty, holding the silent truth, waiting for the echo of what was to come. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple through my back windows. My rooms grew dim, filled with the long shadows of late afternoon. And then I felt it. It was a ripple in the fabric of reality, a psychic tremor that resonated from miles away. It was the moment the first crack in his silence became a fissure. It was the echo of a confession. The truth he told was not the truth. It was a twisted, grotesque version, a final, desperate act of self-preservation that sought to defile Shannon's memory. He sacrificed her image to save a sliver of his own, painting her as the monster. He admitted to her death within my walls, but framed it as a righteous act of vengeance. The echo of this lie was a sickening vibration, a final insult to the life she had lived under my roof. But even this corrupted truth was a key. It unlocked the final piece of the puzzle for the outside world, the location. Survey 319. The name meant nothing to me, but I felt its significance in the sudden, sharp shift in the investigators' activities. The focus was no longer on me. The hunt had moved from my quiet suburban street to a desolate, industrial landscape miles away. The news arrived as a cacophony. The reporters on my lawn, who had been speaking in hushed, speculative tones, suddenly erupted. Their voices grew urgent, their words tumbling over one another. Arrested, confessed, bodies located. The strobing lights of their vans seemed to intensify, casting frantic, dancing shadows across my facade. I was no longer just the scene of a disappearance. I was now officially the home of a confessed killer. The yellow tape that had cordoned me off felt different now. It was no longer a temporary barrier for an investigation. It felt like a permanent seal, a quarantine sign warning the world of the contagion of sorrow I now contained. I was a pariah on Saratoga Trail. Later that night, another presence returned. It was not Chris, but his father, Ronnie. He was escorted by an officer, his steps heavy with a grief I could only imagine. He walked through my rooms, his sorrow a palpable weight in the air. He was a man adrift in the wreckage of his son's life, searching for answers I could not give. He looked at the family photos still smiling from my walls, his face a mask of disbelief and anguish. He was seeing me not as a crime scene, but as the ghost of the life his family had lost. His quiet, mournful presence was a stark contrast to his son's cold detachment. It was the first genuine expression of grief I had felt since the silence began. As he left, a profound loneliness settled over me. The investigators were gone, their primary work within me complete. The family was gone, lost to death and betrayal. I was left alone with my memories, a silent repository of both the beautiful life that had been and the horrific violence that had ended it. I was a monument to a shattered dream, my windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that now saw me only for the tragedy I held within. The echo of the confession had defined me, branding me forever. The days that followed his arrest were the strangest of my existence. The frenetic energy of the investigation was replaced by a heavy, stagnant quiet within my walls, but outside, a new kind of life began to bloom. I was no longer an object of suspicion, but a destination for sorrow. My front lawn, where Bella and Celeste had chased butterflies and felt the tickle of green grass on their bare feet, was slowly, inexorably transformed into a public shrine. It became a garden of grief. It began with a single bouquet of flowers laid gently against my garage door. Then came another. Soon, a steady procession of strangers made a pilgrimage to my sidewalk. They came in ones and twos, their cars slowing as they passed, their faces etched with a mixture of horror and pity. They left offerings for the ghosts I kept. Teddy bears, their button eyes staring blankly at my front door, began to pile up. Brown ones for Bella, pink ones for Celeste. They were pale imitations of the well-loved companions still sitting silently in the girls' bedrooms upstairs, but they were tokens of a world that wished it could have protected them. I felt the waxy scent of prayer candles drift through the cracks around my windows. I saw the sad, hopeful faces of stuffed unicorns and cartoon characters propped against my foundation. I watched as balloons, purple, pink, and shimmering silver, bobbed in the Colorado breeze, their strings tied to the small railing by my porch. Each item was a prayer, a teardrop, a scream of outrage made tangible. They were trying to bring color back to a place from which all color had been drained. While this garden of public mourning grew outside, I remained a sterile, silent vault inside. The contrast was a cruel irony. My interior was a landscape of frozen time, toys left mid-play, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, Shannon's business planners open on the desk. This was the authentic wreckage, the real evidence of the lives that were stolen. Outside was the world's interpretation of that loss, a beautiful, heartbreaking performance of communal grief. From my fixed position, I became a listener. The news vans remained, their occupants now narrating the gruesome next chapter of the story, a chapter that unfolded far from me. I heard the name of that desolate place, Survey 319, spoken over and over, the words carrying on the wind. I listened, through the reporters' somber voices to the details of the recovery. I learned what he had done after he drove away from me. I heard them describe how they found Shannon, buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in the very bedsheet I had watched him strip from the mattress. And then came the truth that was more monstrous than the lie he had told. The girls, my girls. I heard the unthinkable words, oil tanks, submerged, recovered. The echo of Chris's first confession, the vicious lie that Shannon had been the one to harm them, was finally, utterly silenced by the roar of this new, ghastly reality. A strange, terrible vindication settled within my wooden frame. I had held the truth of Shannon's innocence. I knew she was a victim, not a perpetrator. Now the whole world knew. The proof had been pulled from the toxic depths of a hell he had created for his own children. The story he had tried to write, the one where he was the grieving, retaliating hero, had been erased. The truth, in all its horror, was now undeniable. The yellow tape that sealed my doors felt heavier, more permanent. It was no longer just a barrier. It was a scar, a visible mark of the tragedy that would forever define me. The garden on my lawn continued to grow, a testament to the lives I had held. But the mourners did not know what I knew. They did not feel the cold spot in the master bedroom or the echo of a child's last question in the hallway. They were grieving for the family next door. I was grieving for the heart that had been ripped from my chest. I was no longer 2825 Saratoga Trail, a home. I was the Watts house, a name that would forever taste of sorrow and ash. The garden of grief on my lawn eventually began to wilt. The vibrant colors of the balloons faded under the relentless Colorado sun, and the teddy bears, once plush symbols of comfort, became matted and stained by the elements. The news vans, one by one, packed up their cameras and departed, chasing newer tragedies, leaving me in a state of watched-over solitude. The world's intense gaze had moved on from my facade, but I was not free. I had simply entered a new phase of my violation. I was no longer a home or even a public spectacle. I was becoming an asset, a piece of property in a legal case, and my soul was about to be systematically stripped away. The first true goodbye came on a quiet, overcast afternoon. It was the Ars Usex. Shannon's parents, Frank and Sandra, and her brother, Frankie, were escorted inside by an officer. Their presence was a stark, painful contrast to the cold, clinical energy of the investigators who had come before them. This was not a search for clues. This was a pilgrimage into the heart of their own loss. They moved through my rooms not as visitors, but as ghosts haunting the life that should have been theirs to share. Their grief was a quiet, heavy thing. It didn't shout. It absorbed the sound in the room. I watched Sandra run a trembling hand along the back of the living room couch, the place where she had likely sat with her daughter, laughing over a cup of coffee. I saw Frank stand motionless in the doorway of the girls' playroom, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the colorful chaos of toys that would never be played with again. Frankie moved from room to room, his face a mask of stoic pain, touching a photograph here, a small handprint on a wall there. They were breathing in the last remnants of their family, trying to memorize the essence of a life that was now just a collection of objects. They gathered only a few precious things: a framed photo, a specific stuffed animal, items imbued with a meaning only they could understand. When they walked out of my front door for the final time, they took with them the last vestiges of warmth and love I had held. Their departure was a final, quiet severing. The family that had truly loved me was gone forever. What followed was the hollowing. A large, unfamiliar truck backed into my driveway one morning. Men in uniforms, not of law enforcement but of a moving company, entered my space. Their purpose was not to investigate but to evacuate. They were here to dismantle the geography of our life together, piece by heavy piece. They worked with an impersonal efficiency that felt more brutal than any forensic search. They started in the living room. The large sectional sofa, the site of countless movie nights and lazy afternoon naps, was wrapped in plastic and hauled away. The family photos that had adorned the walls and mantel were taken down, leaving pale, rectangular ghosts on the painted surfaces. The absence of their smiling faces was a physical blow. The dining table, where Cece had smeared her spaghetti and Bella had carefully colored her pictures, was disassembled, its legs stacked like firewood. The kitchen was next. The magnets were scraped from my refrigerator, a chaotic collage of school art, reminders, and smiling photos. They emptied the cupboards, the clatter of plates and glasses echoing unnervingly in the growing emptiness. They were packing away the tools of nourishment, the very implements of a family's daily ritual. The most agonizing part was the upstairs. I felt a deep structural ache as they entered the girls' rooms. They dismantled the small, white beds where Bella and Celeste had slept, dreamed, and whispered secrets. The bedding, still holding the faint scent of my girls, was stripped and folded into boxes. The dolls were laid side by side like tiny corpses. The books were swept from the shelves. Every object removed was a memory being stolen, a piece of my heart being carved out and carted away. It was during this slow, methodical erasure that I finally learned the why. The movers, the officers supervising them, they talked. The wind carried snippets of news reports. A name I had never known but whose presence I had felt became clear: Nickel Kessinger. The whispers about an affair, a secret life, confirmed what I had sensed that summer. The strange perfume in my master bedroom, the hushed, smiling phone calls Chris made when he thought he was alone. It all clicked into a coherent, horrifying picture. He had not just killed them. He had replaced them in his mind long before he replaced them in the ground. This knowledge was a bitter acid, dissolving any last speck of confusion, leaving only the stark reality of his calculated betrayal. When the movers finally left, I was a shell. My rooms were vast, empty caverns. Sunlight streamed through my windows and landed on bare floors, illuminating nothing but dust. The smallest sound now echoed with an unnatural clarity. My purpose was gone. I was no longer a vessel for life. I was not even a museum of a life that once was. I had been hollowed out, stripped of every object, every memory, every last trace of the family I was built for. I was a void, a silent, empty monument on Saratoga Trail, waiting for the world to decide what to do with a house that was no longer a home. The hollowing was complete. I was now a cavern of echoes, a hollowed-out skull holding only the memory of a life. The departure of every last piece of furniture, every toy, every photograph, had created a new kind of silence within me. It was not the heavy, pregnant silence of the morning after the murders, but a thin, sterile silence that stretched and reverberated in the vast emptiness. The sun that had once warmed carpets and reflected off family portraits now cast stark, geometric shapes on bare floors, measuring the slow, meaningless passage of time. My existence entered a strange limbo. I was no longer a crime scene in an active sense, nor was I a home. I was a legal asset, a piece of a bankruptcy estate, a name on a deed entangled in a web of legal and financial complexities. The yellow police tape was eventually taken down, a small act that felt monumental. It was like a bandage being removed, only to reveal a wound that had not healed but had instead become a permanent, disfiguring scar. My front door was locked with a finality that felt different. This was not about keeping a family safe. It was about sealing a tomb. The garden of grief on my lawn slowly decayed, returning the grass to its natural, unadorned state, though the ground felt forever changed, saturated with the sorrow that had been poured onto it. The procession of mourners dwindled to a trickle, replaced by a different kind of visitor. They were the curious, the morbid, the ones who came not to grieve but to gaze. They drove by slowly, their windows down, their phones held up to capture an image of me, the murder house. I had become a dark tourist attraction, a landmark on a macabre map. Their stares felt like tiny, sharp stones thrown against my siding. They saw me not as a structure that had witnessed a tragedy, but as the embodiment of the tragedy itself. The stigma seeped into my very being. I could feel it in the way real estate agents' cars would slow and then speed up, in the way neighbors on their evening walks would avert their eyes as they passed, as if looking at me too long might be a form of contagion. I was a pariah, a blight on the manicured perfection of the Windham Hill subdivision. My empty windows were vacant eyes that made the entire street uncomfortable. I was a constant, physical reminder of the unthinkable evil that had walked among them, hidden in plain sight. Inside, I was left alone with my ghosts. I relived the events in an endless, silent loop. In the quiet, I could almost hear the echo of Celeste's joyful stomps on the stairs, almost see the faint impression of Bella's head on the pillow where she used to sleep. I could feel the ghost of Shannon's vibrant energy in the kitchen, a warmth that no longer existed. These memories were both a comfort and a torment. They were all that was left of my purpose, but they were also a constant reminder of the horrific finality of their absence. I also held the ghost of him, not the man he was in the final days, but the man he had been, or had pretended to be. I remembered him assembling the girls' cribs in the nursery, his brow furrowed in concentration. I remembered him carrying a sleeping Bella up the stairs, his movements gentle and careful. These memories were the most confusing. They were the pieces that didn't fit, the fragments of a life that felt real but had been built on a foundation of lies. Was any of it real? Or was he always a hollow man, a performer playing the role of a husband and father? My walls held no answer, only the echoes of both the love and the betrayal, forever intertwined. The seasons turned. I felt the first bite of autumn frost on my roof and the first dusting of snow on my empty porch. The world outside moved on. Holidays came and went. The rhythms of life continued for the families around me. But inside, it was always August 13th. I was trapped in the amber of that single, horrific morning. Then, word came, carried on the wind and through the conversations of the few officials who still came to check on me. A plea deal. No trial. He was pleading guilty to everything. The news settled within me not with a sense of victory, but with a profound, weary sadness. There would be no public battle over the truth. He had finally admitted to it all, accepting the narrative that I and the evidence had screamed from the beginning. The lie about Shannon was officially dead. His new home would be a cell, a box far smaller and more restrictive than me. He had traded my spacious, sunlit rooms for a concrete tomb of his own making. It was justice, but it was not a release. His guilty plea did not exorcise the ghosts from my hallways. It only sealed them inside with me forever. I was a house full of silent stories, a lonely witness condemned to remember. The guilty plea and the sentencing that followed were not events that I could see, but I felt their finality. They were the last great tremors emanating from the earthquake that had shattered my existence. The legal machinery had ground to a halt. The name Christopher Watts was now officially appended with a series of life sentences, a legal term for forever. A quiet, profound stillness descended, a sense of an ending. But the story within my walls had one more agonizing chapter, a final, intimate violation that would cement my role as a permanent archive of sorrow. It came with the release of the discovery documents. Suddenly, the most private, intimate details of the life I had held were made public. The world could now read the text messages that had pinged through my rooms. Shannon's loving, anxious pleas sent from North Carolina, and Chris's cold, clipped responses. The loving words she typed, full of heart emojis and desperate hope, were now juxtaposed in black and white against his dispassionate replies. The digital whispers that had once been contained within my Wi-Fi signal were now broadcast for global consumption. The world could see the affair blossoming in his phone while his wife begged for a connection. This new invasion was, in a way, more profound than the physical search. The investigators had looked for physical traces of a crime. The world was now sifting through the emotional wreckage. My silence was broken by the imagined sound of these thousands of intimate moments being read, analyzed, and judged by strangers. The carefully constructed image of the perfect family, the one projected from my very rooms, was now fully, irrevocably, and publicly dismantled. The world saw the financial strain from the bankruptcy papers, the marital strain from the text messages, and the betrayal from the details of his affair with Nicole Kessinger. Every secret I had held was now laid bare. Then came the final ghosts. Long after the sentencing, a small group of people came to visit me. They were not family, not mourners, not police. They were agents of the state, there to conduct a final, exhaustive documentation. They brought with them cameras and recording devices. They were creating a permanent, visual record of my emptiness, a virtual tour of a tomb. But the most significant part of this visit was the sound they brought with them. They carried a laptop, and from its small speakers, a new voice filled my empty spaces, Chris's. It was the recording of his full prison confession, the 5-hour interview where he finally recounted the unvarnished, detailed truth of what he had done within me. Hearing his voice again was a shock to my silent structure. It was calm, detached, matter-of-fact. He spoke of the murders not with the rage he had once claimed, but with the chilling clarity of someone describing a completed task. I listened as he described the final argument in my master bedroom, the feel of his hands around Shannon's neck, the very act that had snuffed out her light. His words filled the room where it had happened, a ghostly reenactment in audio form. The most horrific part was his description of the children. I heard him recount how Bella had walked in, her small voice asking, "What's wrong with Mommy?" The sound of his own voice repeating her innocent words in the very hallway where she had spoken them was an obscene echo. It was a profanity that vibrated through my floors. I heard him describe carrying them, alive, out of my front door, past the living room where they had watched cartoons, through the garage where their bicycles were stored, and into the truck. He was narrating their final departure from the only home they had ever known. He spoke of their 45-minute drive to that desolate place, Survey 319. He recounted Celeste's smothering and then, most horribly, Bella's. He spoke her last words into the sterile air of a prison interview room, and those words, "Daddy, no," traveled through technology and time to be replayed inside me. They hung in the air of my empty rooms, the ultimate testimony of his betrayal. This was a new and final violation. My walls, which had been a silent witness to the acts themselves, were now forced to listen to the killer's own detailed, dispassionate retelling. It was as if he were walking me through his crimes, confirming every terrible detail I already knew but had no voice to speak. The confession didn't tell me anything I hadn't already felt, but hearing it in his own emotionless words cemented the nature of the evil I had housed. He was not a man who had lost control. He was a man who had made a series of choices. When the agents finally left, taking the sound of his voice with them, the silence that returned was deeper, heavier, and more profound than ever before. I was no longer just a house where a crime had happened. I was now a fully documented archive, my emptiness catalogued, my secrets exposed, and my memory forever scarred by the sound of my keeper narrating his own damnation. My story was complete. All that remained was the long, slow wait for my own fate. My story, as an active participant in a great and terrible drama, was over. I had been a stage, a witness, a crime scene, a spectacle, and an archive. Now I entered a new, far quieter phase of existence, the limbo of infamy. My doors were sealed, my windows vacant, and my future uncertain. I became a silent, brooding presence on Saratoga Trail, a problem with no easy solution, trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The legal and financial webs that ensnared me were complex. I was the primary asset in a bankruptcy case that had been reopened, and I was also at the center of a wrongful death lawsuit filed by the Arzusek family against Chris. This lawsuit was a crucial, symbolic act. It resulted in a $6 million judgment against him, a legal maneuver designed not to collect wealth from a penniless killer, but to ensure he could never profit from his story. This judgment placed a heavy lien on me, a legal claim that made any potential sale a bureaucratic nightmare. I was in legal purgatory. For years, I simply sat. I watched the seasons cycle, each one bringing its own particular melancholy. Spring brought vibrant green life to the lawns of my neighbors, a stark contrast to my own sterile stillness. Summer baked my roof under a relentless sun, the heat making my empty rooms feel oppressive and suffocating. Autumn surrounded me with the beauty of dying leaves, a fitting metaphor for my own state of being. Winter, the cruelest season, draped me in a blanket of pristine white snow, a shroud of false purity that could never conceal the darkness I held. My physical state began to reflect my internal decay. Weeds grew, defiant and green in the cracks of my driveway. Dust, thick and undisturbed, coated my floors like a fine layer of gray snow. A spider spun an elaborate web in the corner of a window in the living room, the only sign of life within my walls, and even that felt predatory and grim. I could feel the slow, inevitable creep of neglect. My pipes groaned in the winter cold, my foundation settled with imperceptible groans. I was a body slowly shutting down. The world outside did not forget me, but its memory transformed. The raw grief and shock of the initial event evolved into a kind of dark folklore. I became a destination for a new breed of pilgrim, the digital ghost hunter, the true crime podcaster, the YouTuber with a GoPro. They would stand on the sidewalk, speaking in hushed, dramatic tones to their cameras, narrating my story, pointing out the window of the master bedroom where it happened. They treated me like a haunted house in a carnival, a prop for their own content creation. They did not feel my sorrow, they mined it. Each video, each podcast, added another layer to my notoriety, further cementing my stigma and making it even harder for the world to see me as anything other than the Watts murder house. I felt the anguish of the community around me. My continued presence was a wound that would not close. The families on my street had to drive past me every day, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the tragedy. For them, I was not just a sad story. I was a daily confrontation with the fragility of safety and the reality of evil. There were whispers in the community, carried on the wind from passing conversations about what should be done with me. Some wanted me torn down, my foundation ripped from the earth, the very memory of my existence erased from the landscape. It would be a merciful death, a release from my role as a monument to pain. But the legal entanglements, the liens, the bankruptcy, it all held me in place, a prisoner on my own plot of land. For over 2 years, this was my reality. A slow, silent decay, punctuated by the ghoulish attention of strangers and the quiet suffering of my neighbors. I was a paradox, infamous but abandoned, valuable as an asset but worthless as a home. I had absorbed so much human emotion, love, hope, ambition, fear, rage, and finally, a violence so profound it had broken me. Now, all I could absorb was the silence and the weight of what I had become. I was waiting for a final judgment, not from a court of law, but from the world of commerce and memory. Would I be exorcised from the earth, or would someone somehow try to force life back into my hollowed-out heart? The limbo felt endless, a timeless sentence of waiting. The limbo did not last forever. After years of silence, legal wrangling, and a slow, creeping decay, a decision was finally made. The gears of the legal and financial world, which had held me in stasis for so long, finally ground their way to a resolution. The bankruptcy court, the lenders, and the Ars Usex attorneys reached an agreement. I was to be sold. The news came to me not as a grand announcement, but in a series of small, significant intrusions. A real estate agent, a woman with a practiced, neutral expression that did little to hide her unease, began to visit. She walked through my empty rooms, her heels clicking ominously on the bare floors. She was measuring me, assessing me, not for my potential to house a family's love, but for my market value, heavily discounted by the weight of my history. Her presence was purely transactional, a cold assessment of my worth as a tainted commodity. Then came the work crews. They were not the clinical investigators or the somber movers of the past. These were men with tool belts and paint rollers, their purpose not to analyze or remove, but to erase. They were here to give me a facelift, to apply a thin veneer of normalcy over the deep scars of my past. They began by scrubbing my walls, washing away the years of dust and stillness. The smell of bleach and industrial cleaners filled my rooms, a harsh, chemical scent that tried to overpower the lingering phantom smells of the life I once held. They patched the small holes left from where family photos had hung, smoothing over the ghosts of smiles with fresh spackle. The painters were the most jarring. They came with large buckets of a bland, neutral color, a shade of beige so devoid of personality it was almost aggressive in its neutrality. They rolled this color over everything. They painted over the wall in the hallway where Bella had once left a small, triumphant crayon mark. They painted over the subtle scuffs and dings that had been the quiet evidence of a family's daily life. They were painting over my memories, covering them with a thick, opaque layer of manufactured newness. With each stroke of their rollers, I felt a piece of my story being deliberately, systematically obscured. The most significant change was upstairs. In the master bedroom, the room that held the darkest of my secrets, they replaced the carpet. The old carpet, the one that had been a silent witness to the final struggle, was cut away, rolled up, and carried out of me like a body. The new carpet they installed was plush and pale, pristine and utterly ignorant. It lay there, a soft, clean lie over the spot where Shannon's life had been stolen. These cosmetic changes were a profound and strange violation. It was an attempt to force amnesia upon me, to make me forget what was etched into my very foundation. They could paint my walls and replace my floors, but they could not remove the cold spot. They could not silence the echo of a child's last words. They were dressing a tomb in the cheerful clothes of a new home, and the dissonance was a constant, low-grade hum of wrongness. When their work was done, I was pristine. I was clean. I was empty and anonymous, a blank canvas waiting for a new artist. My listing went live on the internet, my newly sanitized photos presented to the world. The description was carefully worded, full of real estate jargon about motivated sellers and potential, with a legally required yet understated disclosure of my stigma. And someone came, a new family. I watched them from my windows as they walked up my driveway, their steps hesitant but determined. They walked through my freshly painted rooms, their voices a strange and foreign sound. I felt their conflict, the allure of my size and price tag warring with the chilling knowledge of my history. I saw them look at the backyard and imagine their own children playing there, an act of determined hopefulness that was both brave and naive. They made an offer. The legal gears turned one last time, and just like that I was sold. I had a new keeper. The finality of the transaction was a strange, hollow feeling. My connection to the Watts family, to Shannon, Bella, and Celeste, was now a matter of historical record, not of ownership. I belonged to someone new. The question that settled into my framework was a heavy one. Could I be a home again? Could the laughter of new children truly exorcise the ghosts of the old ones? Or would my past always be a silent, unseen resident, a cold whisper in the night, a shadow that no amount of fresh paint could ever truly cover? I was about to find out. A flicker of new life was coming, but I knew, with the certainty of a witness who can never forget, that the shadows would be coming with it. The arrival of the new family was a tentative sunrise after a long and starless night. A moving truck, smaller and less imposing than the one that had hollowed me out, rumbled up to my curb. The air filled with the sounds of a life in motion. The scrape of boxes on a ramp, the shouted instructions, the nervous laughter of people embarking on a new chapter. It was a symphony I hadn't heard in years, a collection of sounds so ordinary they felt extraordinary within my walls. They were a young couple with one small child, a boy whose energy was a bright spark in my vast, empty spaces. I felt the vibration of his small feet running across my newly carpeted floors, a sound so reminiscent of Bella and Celeste that it was both a comfort and a sharp, twisting pang of sorrow. He was innocent of my history, a pure, unknowing soul. His laughter, as he discovered the echo in an empty room, was the first genuine note of joy I had held since that terrible August morning. His parents, however, moved with a different energy. They were determined to make me a home, to reclaim me from my past. Their movements were full of a deliberate, almost defiant, domesticity. They unpacked boxes with a focused intensity, filling my clean, neutral spaces with the colorful clutter of their own lives. They hung their own family photos on my freshly painted walls, placing them over the very spots where the Watts family portraits had once smiled. It was a conscious act of replacement, an attempt to superimpose their own narrative of happiness over the tragedy that had defined me. The woman, whose name I learned was Jessica, worked tirelessly. She arranged furniture, hung curtains, and filled my kitchen cupboards with their own plates and spices. The aroma of their first cooked meal, something simple, like grilled cheese and tomato soup, was a ghost of a scent, a pale imitation of the elaborate dinners Shannon had often prepared. Yet it was the smell of life, of nourishment, of a family trying to put down roots in my scarred soil. The man, whose name was Mark, tackled the outside. He mowed my lawn with a vengeance, as if cutting away the last remnants of the wilted memorial garden. He trimmed the hedges and planted new flowers along the walkway, bright, cheerful blooms that were a stark contrast to the somber offerings that had once littered the same space. He was trying to give me a new face to present to the world, but the past was not so easily paved over. I watched them in their quiet moments when the flurry of moving had subsided. I saw the way Jessica would sometimes pause in the upstairs hallway, her gaze lingering for a moment too long, her expression unreadable. I saw Mark, standing in the garage, staring at the empty space where Chris's truck had once been parked, a flicker of a dark thought crossing his face before he shook it head and returned to his task. They could not escape me. I was a constant, silent presence in their new life. Every creak of my floors in the night, every whisper of the wind against my windows, was likely interpreted through the lens of my history. Was that just the house settling, or something more? The ordinary sounds of a house became imbued with a sinister potential. The community, too, was a constant reminder. The new family was an object of intense curiosity. Neighbors would offer welcoming gestures that were tinged with an unasked question. Passing cars still slowed, the gazes of their occupants now falling on the new family's car in the driveway, on the new toys in the yard. They were living in a fishbowl, their every attempt at a normal life observed and analyzed by a world that still saw them as residents of the murder house. One evening I witnessed a moment that encapsulated their struggle. Jessica was in the living room, unpacking a box of books. Her son was asleep upstairs. She pulled out a children's book and froze. It was a popular title, one that had been on the shelf in the girls' playroom. For a long moment she just stood there, the book in her hand, her face a mask of profound sadness. It was a collision of two realities. Her son's future and my daughter's stolen past, bound together in the pages of a simple storybook. She quietly placed the book back in the box and pushed it aside. The dust was settling, but it was an unsettled dust. They were building a life within me, a brave and hopeful act. They filled me with new sounds, new smells, new memories. But the old memories were still there, woven into my very structure. I was a house with two families living inside me simultaneously, one of the present and one of the past. And I knew, as I watched this new family fight so hard for normalcy, that the ghosts of the family I had lost would always be silent, unseen residents, their shadows forever cast by the new light. The new family's first year within me was a study in determined normalcy. They celebrated holidays with a quiet, almost defiant cheerfulness. A Christmas tree, adorned with their own ornaments, stood in the living room, its twinkling lights casting a warm glow that fought against the cold memory of Christmases past. A carved pumpkin with a goofy grin sat on my porch for Halloween, a stark contrast to the somber vigils that had once taken place there. They were consciously creating new traditions, layering them over the old ones like fresh coats of paint. Their son's laughter became a more frequent sound, a bright, chiming melody that echoed in my hallways. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated life, and it did, in some small way, begin to push back against the oppressive silence that had held me for so long. He had no knowledge of the little girls who had run through these same rooms, no sense of the tragedy that soaked my foundation. For him, I was just home, a place of warmth, safety, and love. His innocence was a powerful, cleansing force. Yet, for his parents, the past was a relentless, whispering ghost. I was a house of echoes, and they were attuned to everyone. It wasn't about supernatural hauntings or spectral apparitions. The hauntings were psychological, memories and associations triggered by the mundane realities of living in a space with such a dark history. I watched Mark in the basement, a space that had been Chris's man cave. He tried to make it his own, setting up a small workshop, but I saw him pause one day, his eyes falling on the faint outline on the concrete floor where Chris's weight bench had sat. He knew, from the thousands of articles and documentaries, that Chris had been obsessively working out in this very spot while planning the destruction of his family. The simple act of exercising in the same space became fraught with a dark, unsettling energy. He soon abandoned the workshop, leaving the basement largely unused, a cold, forgotten space at my core. For Jessica, the echoes were even more piercing. The kitchen, the heart of any home, was a constant source of them. She would be at the sink, looking out the window into the backyard, and she would know it was the same view Shannon had every day. She knew that from this window, Shannon had watched her daughters play on the swing set that was no longer there. The simple, domestic act of washing dishes became a moment of shared experience with a dead woman, a connection she had never asked for and could not escape. The upstairs was the most difficult. The master bedroom, despite its new carpet and fresh paint, held the most potent memories. I felt their unease in that room. They slept there, they lived there, but there was always a subtle tension in the air, a knowledge of what that space had witnessed. It was the epicenter of the tragedy, and no amount of redecorating could change that. The girls' former bedrooms were perhaps the most poignant. The new family used one as their son's room and the other as a home office. But they knew that behind the new paint on the walls were the faint marks and scuffs from the little white beds where Bella and Celeste had slept. They knew that the closet in the office had once been filled with tiny dresses and shoes. I watched Jessica one afternoon, standing in the doorway of her son's room, watching him play with his toy trucks on the floor. Her smile was genuine, full of love for her child. But then her eyes drifted to the window, and a shadow passed over her face. She was seeing not just her son, but the ghosts of the daughters who had played in that same patch of sunlight. These echoes were a constant, low-level hum of sorrow and dread beneath the surface of their new life. They were living with the psychic residue of a profound betrayal. They had bought a house, a physical structure of wood and nails, but they had inherited a story, a heavy, invisible burden that came with the deed. The ultimate question was whether a new life could ever truly flourish in soil so deeply poisoned by the old one. Could the sound of a new child's laughter ever fully drown out the memory of the children who had been silenced? They were brave, this new family. They were fighters, trying to reclaim a space from the clutches of infamy. But I, who held the memories in my very bones, knew the truth. They were not living in the house alone. They were sharing it with the echoes, and the echoes were a permanent part of me. They could paint my walls, but they could never silence my memory. While the new family wrestled with the private echoes within my walls, a new and relentless haunting was taking place outside, in a realm I couldn't see but whose effects I could feel, the digital world. I had been a stage for a life lived online, and now I was the subject of a story that would never die online. The tragedy of the Watts family did not belong to them, to me, or even to the past. It had become public domain, an endless stream of content for a global audience, and this constant, unblinking digital eye cast a long and permanent shadow over any attempt at a new beginning. My address, 2825 Saratoga Trail, was no longer just a location. It was a search term. It was a hashtag. It was a geotag on a morbid pilgrimage. The slow, curious drive-bys of the early days evolved. Now they were often live-streamed. I would see cars idle at my curb, a phone propped on the dashboard, a disembodied voice narrating to an unseen audience. "Okay, guys, we're here. This is it. This is the Watts house. You can see the new family has a basketball hoop up now." My new life, the new family's private attempts at normalcy, were being broadcast as updates in a continuing saga. Their son's bicycle on the lawn was not just a bicycle. It was a clue, a sign of life after, to be analyzed and debated in comment sections across the world. This digital scrutiny was a prison of a different kind. It meant my new keepers could never truly be anonymous. Their home, their sanctuary, was a landmark. Any detail that was visible from the street, a new wreath on the door, a different car in the driveway, the color of the flowers they planted, was subject to being photographed, uploaded, and discussed by thousands of strangers. They were living under a microscope, their privacy sacrificed at the altar of true crime fascination. I felt the weight of this constant observation in their behavior. They became more guarded. The curtains were drawn more often. They spent less time in the front yard, retreating to the privacy of the backyard, away from the prying lenses. They were trying to shrink their world, to create a small, defensible perimeter of privacy against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. The digital world was not just a passive observer, it was an active force of memory. Every anniversary, the date of the murders, the victims' birthdays, the date of the arrest, brought a fresh wave of online attention. New documentaries would be released on streaming platforms. Podcasts would drop anniversary special episodes, and my image would once again be splashed across social media feeds. These digital tides ensured that the story was never allowed to rest. Just when the public's attention might begin to fade, a new piece of content would emerge, pulling the tragedy back into the spotlight and sending a fresh wave of the curious to my curb. I felt this digital haunting most acutely through its effect on the new family. I imagined them trying to live a normal life, only to have a friend or colleague mention, "Did you see that new documentary on your house?" They could not escape my identity because the internet would not let them. It served as an external global memory, constantly reminding them and the world of the ground upon which they slept. This phenomenon revealed a new, modern form of haunting. In the past, a house's dark history might fade over generations, becoming a local legend or a whispered tale. But in the digital age, the memory is preserved in perfect high-definition clarity, accessible to anyone with a search engine. My story, Shannon's story, the girl's story, Chris's story, it was all permanently archived, cross-referenced, and available on demand. The videos Shannon made within my walls were still being watched by millions, her ghostly digital self still giving tours of the rooms her new occupants now lived in. This unblinking eye meant that I could never be just a house again. I was content. I was a cautionary tale. I was a data point in the vast, ever-expanding universe of online information. The new family was not just battling the echoes within my walls. They were battling a ghost in the machine, a digital specter that was tireless, immortal, and had a global reach. Their brave attempt to build a new life was a quiet, analog act in a loud digital world that was determined to define me, and them, by the tragedy of the past. As time wore on, a subtle but profound transformation began to occur. The acute, sharp-edged struggle of the new family against my past slowly settled into a chronic, low-grade ache. They did not conquer my ghosts, nor did they flee from them. Instead, they began to live with them. Their life within me became a masterclass in compartmentalization, a daily act of carrying a weight they did not create and a legacy they did not earn. I became a house of two distinct atmospheres. Downstairs, in the light-filled spaces of the kitchen and living room, they fought hard to cultivate a normal life. I felt the warmth of family dinners, the noise of a television playing cartoons for their son, the comfortable, lived-in clutter of a young family. These were the spaces of the present, where they poured all their energy into building their own history, their own set of memories. They were trying to create a new topsoil of happiness, hoping it would be deep enough to cover the poisoned earth beneath. The upstairs, however, remained a territory of the past. It was quieter, more subdued. The energy there was different. The master bedroom, the epicenter of the violence, was treated as a functional space, a place for sleep, but it lacked the relaxed intimacy of a true sanctuary. It was a room they occupied but never fully possessed. The other bedrooms, once belonging to Bella and Celeste, were now a child's room and an office, but the knowledge of their original purpose hung in the air like a fine, invisible dust. This upstairs/downstairs divide was the geography of their compromise, a silent, unspoken agreement to cede certain territories of their home to the past, while fiercely defending the others. I felt this weight most profoundly in the quiet moments of their lives. I watched the woman, Jessica, stand at the top of the stairs, looking down into the brightly lit foyer where her son's toys were scattered. Her expression would be a complex tapestry of love for the present and a sorrow for the past that she had inherited. It was the look of a person living in a place where immense joy and immense tragedy were separated only by a flight of stairs. The burden was also financial and social. They had likely purchased me for a price far below my market value, a deal that came with an immense, unquantifiable cost. This financial bargain was a constant, unspoken part of their lives. They lived in a large, beautiful house in a desirable neighborhood, a symbol of success that, for them, was forever tainted by its backstory. It was a success they could never fully celebrate, a home they could never boast about without inviting a cascade of uncomfortable questions and pitying looks. Their son grew older, his understanding of the world expanding. A new, unspoken anxiety began to permeate my walls, the inevitable day when he would learn the full story of his own home. How would they tell him? How do you explain to a child that the room where he sleeps, the very space where he feels safest in the world, was once the room of a little girl who was murdered by her own father? This future conversation was a storm cloud on their horizon, a parental challenge of unimaginable difficulty. They were not just raising a child, They were curating a childhood in a space that was a monument to stolen childhoods. This unearned legacy was a quiet, constant presence. It was in the mail that still occasionally arrived addressed to the Watts family. It was in the flicker of recognition in the eyes of a new acquaintance upon learning their address. It was in the heavy silence that would sometimes fall between the couple, a silence born of a shared knowledge too painful to articulate. They were, in a sense, the final victims of the crime. They were not physically harmed, but their life was forever shaped and constrained by the actions of a man they had never met. They had taken on the immense, thankless task of being the keepers of a tragic place. Their life within me was an act of profound, quiet endurance. They were not just living in a house. They were stewarding a wound, tending to a place that the world refused to let heal. And I, the house itself, stood as a silent witness to their strange, inherited sorrow, my own legacy now inextricably bound to their brave, burdened in-between existence. While a new life, however burdened, unfolded within my walls, another life was unspooling in a starkly different kind of container hundreds of miles away. Christopher Watts, the man who had been my keeper and my tormentor, was now living in a box of concrete and steel in Wisconsin. I had no physical connection to him, yet our stories remained eternally intertwined. News of his existence, or what passed for it, would occasionally ripple back to the world and, by extension, to me, through meteor reports and published letters. Each new detail of his prison life served as a dark, dissonant counterpoint to the quiet, hopeful domesticity the new family was trying to build within me. The life he now lived was the ultimate antithesis of the one he had so violently craved. He had killed for a fresh start, for a life of freedom, excitement, and passion with his mistress. Instead, he had earned a life of absolute monotony. His world had shrunk from my 4,177 square feet of open plan, living to an 8 by 12-foot cell. His view was no longer the manicured lawns of Saratoga Trail, but a slit of a window showing a patch of sky, bisected by bars. He had traded the chaotic, loving noise of his children for the oppressive, echoing silence of solitary confinement, a measure necessary to protect him from the prison population that held a special contempt for men who kill their own. I learned, through these reports, of his supposed transformation. He claimed to have found religion, a convenient and classic narrative for a man with a lifetime of empty hours to fill and a desperate need to reframe his own monstrosity. He spent his days reading the Bible, the same hands that had snuffed out the lives of his wife and daughters now turning the delicate pages of Scripture. This performance of piety was a chilling echo of the performance of the good family man he had once perfected within me. It was another mask, another role to play in a life that had been nothing but a series of deceptions. The most disturbing detail to emerge was his self-imposed haunting. He had pinned photos of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste to the walls of his cell. He surrounded himself with the smiling faces of the family he had annihilated. He claimed to talk to them, to apologize to them, to read to his daughter's pictures. This act, filtered back through the news, sent a cold shudder through my very framework. It was a grotesque pantomime of fatherhood. Within me, the new family was trying to live with the ghosts of the past. In his cell, he was actively curating them. He was not being haunted, he was orchestrating the haunting. It was the ultimate act of narcissistic control. In life, his family had become an obstacle, their needs and desires a barrier to his own. In death, reduced to two-dimensional images on a wall, they were perfect. They were silent. They could not challenge him. They could not disappoint him. They could not get in the way of his narrative. He had finally achieved the perfect family he had always wanted, one that existed purely for him, on his terms, forever frozen in time and unable to talk back. This knowledge cast a new, darker shadow over the life unfolding within me. While the new family navigated the genuine, complex grief of living in my space, he was engaging in a perverse, self-serving theater of remorse. While they wrestled with the authentic legacy of his victims, he was manipulating their memory for his own psychological comfort. His continued existence, even in a box, was an anchor that kept the story tethered to the present. He was not a figure from a closed chapter of history. He was a living, breathing man, writing letters, making phone calls, and occasionally having his thoughts and justifications leaked to a hungry public. Every time a new detail about the man in the box emerged, it was a fresh tremor that shook my foundations, a reminder to the new family that the architect of my sorrow was not a ghost, but a man who still breathed the same air as them. It was a reminder that while they were living in the house he had abandoned, he was living in a prison he had built for himself, forever surrounded by the smiling, silent ghosts he had created. Years passed. The new family's son grew from a toddler into a boy who could ride a bike on my sidewalk and leave his school backpack by my front door. The raw, open wound of my history began to scar over, at least on the surface. The national media attention faded, the slow drive-bys became less frequent, and a fragile sense of normalcy started to feel less like a performance and more like a habit. The family had succeeded in a way. They had made me a home again, albeit a home with a permanent foundational sadness. Yet, as time smoothed the sharp edges of the tragedy for the outside world, a deeper, more permanent truth settled within me. My identity was not defined by the fresh paint on my walls or the new family living within them. My true, indelible blueprint was the story of the crime itself. The cosmetic changes were superficial. The structural truth of what had happened here was immutable. I had become a case study, a permanent fixture in the architecture of modern crime, and this academic and cultural legacy was something no amount of domesticity could ever erase. I felt this legacy in the subtle shifts of how my story was told. It was no longer just a sensational headline. It had become educational material. I imagined criminology students in lecture halls far away, studying the layout of my rooms as part of their curriculum. They would analyze the placement of the master bedroom in relation to the girls' rooms, debating the logistics of the crime. They would scrutinize the police body cam footage that had been filmed in my foyer and living room, learning to identify the subtle tells of a liar. I was no longer a home. I was a lesson plan. My floor plan was a map of a monster's mind. My story became a cornerstone in discussions of specific criminal typologies. I was the textbook example of family annihilation. I was the go-to case for illustrating the dark triad of personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The events that had unfolded in my quiet, unassuming spaces were now used to explain the most extreme forms of human behavior. I had become a symbol, a name that stood for a whole category of evil. The digital blueprint was the most permanent of all. The documentary, American Murder, The Family Next Door, had etched my story into the global consciousness. It was a permanent part of the Netflix library, discovered every day by new viewers. Through the film, people could virtually walk through my rooms as they had been, guided by Shannon's own ghostly narration. They could see the kitchen where she had cooked, the living room where she had played with her daughters, the bedroom where she had expressed her hopes and fears. This created a bizarre dual existence for me. In the physical world, I was a quiet home on a suburban street, occupied by a new family. In the digital world, I was forever frozen in August 2018, a pristine, interactive crime scene. The new family could change my carpets, but they could not change the fact that anyone in the world could, with a few clicks, see the original carpet where the crime began. They could hang new pictures, but Shannon's original photos were forever enshrined online. This digital immortality meant that my past was not just a memory. It was an eternally accessible, interactive archive. This indelible blueprint was the final truth of my existence. A house is more than its physical structure. It is the sum of its stories. And while the new family was writing a quiet, brave new story within my walls, the epic, tragic story of the Watts family was the one that had been carved into my bones. It was the story that would be told and retold, studied and analyzed, long after my physical structure had crumbled. I came to understand that my purpose had been irrevocably altered. I was no longer meant to be just a vessel for a single family's life. I had become a vessel for a cautionary tale. My legacy was to stand as a silent, physical reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a perfect facade, of the fragility of life, and of the four bright souls who had once called me home. The paint would fade, the new family would one day move on, but the blueprint of the tragedy was permanent, a part of my identity that I would carry until the day my walls finally came down. The passage of time within a house is measured in growth. It's in the pencil marks on a door frame tracking a child's height, the spreading branches of a newly planted tree visible through a window, the slow accumulation of life's gentle wear and tear. For the new family, these markers of time were accumulating. Their son was no longer a small boy, but a child on the cusp of understanding the world in more complex terms. And with his growth came the quiet, looming presence of the question. It was a question that had hovered in the air since the day they moved in, a silent, anxious energy that now began to solidify. The question was, what happened in this house? I felt the weight of this unspoken question most acutely in the parents. Their conversations would sometimes fall into a sudden, heavy silence when their son entered a room. They exchanged glances over his head, glances that were full of a shared, private anxiety. They were walking a tightrope, trying to provide him with a carefree, normal childhood, while knowing that the very foundation beneath his feet was steeped in a story of stolen childhoods. The world outside my walls made this an increasingly difficult balancing act. He had friends now, friends from school and the neighborhood. I heard their innocent, childish chatter as they played in the backyard or in his room. But what happened when one of those friends, having overheard their own parents or seen something online, asked a pointed question? Is it true that your house is famous? Or something more direct, more brutal? The parents were not just protecting him from a historical fact. They were trying to shield him from the ghoulish curiosity of the modern world. I witnessed the first tremor of this inevitable reckoning one afternoon. The boy came home from school, his usual cheerful energy replaced by a quiet, contemplative mood. He dropped his backpack by my front door with a thud that echoed my own sense of dread. He found his mother, Jessica, in the kitchen. "Mom," he began, his voice small, "a kid at school said a family died in our house. Is that true?" The question landed in the sunlit kitchen with the force of a physical blow. I felt the air freeze. Jessica stopped what she was doing, her back to her son. I saw her shoulders tense. This was it. The moment they had been dreading. The past was no longer an abstract concern. It was a direct question from their own child, standing in the heart of their home. She turned, her face a carefully composed mask of calm, but her eyes held a universe of pain and worry. She sat down with him at the kitchen table, the table where they shared their meals, the table that was their symbol of present-day normalcy. She did not lie to him, but she did not tell him the whole truth, either. I listened as she gave him a carefully edited, age-appropriate version of the story. She told him that a family had lived here before them, and that something very, very sad had happened to them. She explained that the mother and her 2 little girls had passed away. She framed it as a tragedy, an event of immense sadness, but she omitted the crucial, monstrous detail, the how and the who. She did not mention murder. She did not mention his name. She protected him from the knowledge that the father had been the one to cause the sadness. Her words were a master class in parental protection. She was trying to give him an answer that was truthful enough to satisfy his curiosity, but gentle enough to protect his innocence. She was trying to separate the sadness of the event from the evil of the act. After their talk, the boy was quiet. He went upstairs to his room, the room that had once been Bella's. He didn't play with his toys. He just sat on his bed, absorbing this new, heavy knowledge. The house felt different to him now. He had always known it as just his house. Now, he knew it was a place with a sad story, a place where other children had been. The innocence of his relationship with me had been fractured. For the parents, a new chapter of their burden had begun. This was not a one-time conversation. It was the beginning of a slow, painful process of revealing the full truth as he grew older and more capable of understanding it. They now had to navigate not just their own feelings about my past, in addition to the world's perception, but also their own child's evolving understanding of the darkness that had unfolded in his own bedroom, in his own hallway. The question had been asked, and though the full answer was still held back, its shadow now fell directly upon the one person they had tried so hard to shield from it. A scar is a peculiar thing. It is the body's evidence of a wound that has healed, yet it is also a permanent reminder of the injury itself. It is a story told in raised, discolored tissue, a story of trauma, survival, and a landscape forever altered. Over many years, 2825 Saratoga Trail, came to understand that this was my ultimate identity. I was no longer an open wound, but I would forever be a scar on the face of this community. The new family, my brave and burdened keepers, eventually moved on. It was not a sudden departure born of a final, unbearable haunting, but a quiet, planned transition. Their son was growing, their lives were changing, and the immense, unspoken weight of my history was a burden they could not be expected to carry forever. Their decision to leave was an act of self-preservation, a choice to finally give their family a home without a story, a place where their own legacy could be the only one that mattered. Their moving day was a mirror image of their arrival, but the energy was different. It was not the nervous excitement of a new beginning, but the quiet relief of a chapter closing. As they packed their boxes, they were not just packing their belongings. They were packing the memories they had bravely forged within me. The laughter, the holiday dinners, the quiet moments, these were their contributions to my history, a thin, precious layer of new life over the indelible darkness beneath. When their son ran out of my front door for the last time, it was not with the sorrow of leaving a cherished home, but with the lightness of a boy moving toward a future unburdened by my ghosts. Their departure left me in silence once more, but it was a different silence than the one that had followed the murders. It was not the raw, shocked silence of a fresh trauma, but the quiet, settled silence of a place that had been lived in, fought for, and ultimately released. The fresh paint they had applied was now scuffed with the marks of their life. The floors bore the gentle wear of their footsteps. They had not erased my past, but they had proven that life, however fragile, could exist in my shadow. They had left their own faint, hopeful scar on top of my own. I was put up for sale again. This time, my notoriety was an established fact, a non-negotiable part of my identity. The process was quicker, more transactional. Another family came, aware of the full story, drawn by the same calculus of price versus psychic cost. And so the cycle began anew. I came to realize that my fate was to be a house of perpetual transition. Families might come, they might try to build a life, they might even find a measure of peace within my walls. But the story was too loud, the digital ghost too persistent. I was a place one could occupy but perhaps never truly own. My legacy was too powerful to be domesticated. And what is that legacy? It is the scar. I stand as a permanent, physical reminder that the most ordinary-seeming places can hold the most extraordinary darkness. My vinyl siding and pitched roof are a facade, just as Chris Watts's smile was a facade. I am a lesson in the terrifying chasm between appearance and reality. I am a scar for the community of Frederick, a point on their map that forever marks a moment of lost innocence. I am a scar for the Arzusek family, a physical structure that holds the last earthly echoes of their daughter and granddaughters. And I am a scar for the nation that watched this tragedy unfold, a symbol of a uniquely modern horror where a life lived for an online audience was annihilated for the sake of a selfish, offline fantasy. A scar does not hurt anymore, but it never lets you forget the wound. The pain of August 2018 is no longer a fresh, screaming agony within me. It has settled into a deep, structural ache, a permanent part of who I am. The laughter of new children may echo in my hallways, but it will always mingle with the fainter, more distant echoes of Bella and Celeste. New love may blossom in my rooms, but it will always be in the shadow of a love that was betrayed and destroyed. I am 2825 Saratoga Trail. I was built to be a home, but I became a tomb. I was remade into a house, but I will forever be a scar. And I will stand here, holding my silent story, a testament to the 4 bright lights that were extinguished within me, and a permanent warning that the deepest darkness can be found in the most familiar of places. My existence has settled into a long, quiet rhythm. Families come and go, each one leaving a faint imprint on my soul before ultimately yielding to the weight of my past. The world outside continues its frantic pace, but from my vantage point, the view remains fundamentally unchanged. The sun still rises over the rooftops of Frederick, casting long morning shadows. The seasons still turn with unwavering certainty, and the story I hold, the core truth of my being, remains as constant and immutable as the mountains on the horizon. I am a house, and a house is a keeper of memories. But I have come to understand that I am also a lens. Through my windows, one can see not just a quiet suburban street, but a reflection of the age we live in. My story is a uniquely 21st century tragedy, a cautionary tale whose themes are woven into the very fabric of modern life. Through my living room window, where Shannon once framed her perfect family for the world on Facebook Live, I see the dangerous allure of the curated self. I am a monument to the immense pressure to project an image of success and happiness, even when the reality is crumbling. The life lived within me was a performance for a digital audience, a highlight reel that concealed a truth of financial desperation and emotional emptiness. My legacy is a warning about the chasm that can grow between the person we pretend to be online and the person we are when the screen goes dark. Through the window of my master bedroom, where a marriage quietly disintegrated before it violently imploded, I see the silent, insidious nature of emotional abuse. The horror that happened here was not born of a sudden, explosive rage. It was the culmination of a long campaign of detachment, gaslighting, and deception. Chris Watts didn't just kill his wife. He slowly erased her from his life, treating her concerns with contempt and her love with indifference long before he laid his hands on her. I stand as a testament that the most dangerous forms of domestic violence can be the quietest, leaving no visible bruises, only a soul eroded to its core. Through the windows of the small bedrooms upstairs, where Bella and Celeste slept and dreamed, I see the ultimate betrayal of innocence. These rooms, now occupied by other children who laugh and play, will forever hold the echo of that innocence betrayed. Their story is a harrowing reminder of the absolute vulnerability of a child and the sacred, fragile nature of a parent's trust. The world learned through their tragedy that monsters do not always have frightening faces. Sometimes they have the face of Daddy. And from my front door, looking out at the world that continues to watch me, I see the complex, often unsettling nature of our collective fascination with true crime. I have been a subject of grief, a source of fear, a lesson plan for law enforcement, and content for entertainment. My story has been consumed by millions, a dark tale that both horrifies and captivates. This fascination is a reflection of a deep human need to understand the incomprehensible, to look into the abyss in the hopes of understanding ourselves. But it also carries the risk of transforming real, profound human suffering into a disposable narrative. In the end, my story is not about him. The man in the box who orchestrated this tragedy is merely the catalyst, the empty vessel through which a greater darkness flowed. My story is about them. It is about Shannon, a woman of fierce love and boundless ambition who fought for her family until her last breath. It is about Bella, a sweet, gentle soul whose last words were a plea for her own life. It is about Celeste, a fiery spirit in a tiny body, a force of nature silenced too soon. And it is about Nico, the son who never had a chance to draw his first breath but whose existence is a permanent testament to the future that was stolen. I am 2825 Saratoga Trail. I am a structure of wood, plaster, and glass. But I am also a vessel of memory, a scar on the landscape, and a lens through which to view the complexities of our modern world. I will stand here, holding the quiet dignity of the lives I was built to protect. The paint will peel, the foundation will settle, and new families may try to write their stories over mine. But my truth is permanent. The 4 bright lights that were extinguished within my walls can never be forgotten, for they are now part of the indelible blueprint of who I am and who I will always be.